to have been tortured after Obama took office.
Yes, I mean, roughly, we have less than 200 there. So Guantanamo may, in fact, not be closed, but it's being wound down progressively. And I expect certainly in the next couple of years it will be brought to a conclusion. Guantanamo has been a disgrace. It's been a blight. It's really sorely damaged the reputation of the United States globally. And we see this in these proceedings where U.S. allies are standing up demanding that Guantanamo be closed, including the Pope, by the way. But Niall does not address at all the accountability issue. That is the major question. And, you know, I think there's a good reason why Niall can't address it, and that is in the criminal investigations that are already open into torture allegations. And by the way, 9 different countries have criminal investigations pending right now, focusing on allegations of torture by the United States, mostly by the CIA. One figure emerges as the principal potential defendant, and that's David Addington, who's Niall's boss at the Heritage Foundation. He was chief of staff to Vice President Cheney. He has emerged as the clear architect of the policy of torture. And he's the person who, frankly, should be the subject of accountability process. The law requires an investigation. It doesn't require prosecution.
Let's have Niall Gardner respond to this. I suspect you'll disagree with these statements, won't you?
This idea that the United States has been roaming the world torturing people is frankly ridiculous. And I would emphasize that the United States has been the leading force for freedom in the world for a very long time. And we should be focusing upon the fact that the United States has made huge sacrifices, along with key allies like Great Britain, for example, in the defense of freedom, the liberation of 50 million people in Iraq and Afghanistan. We're also fighting a global war against a vicious enemy that seeks our destruction. And I do think it's extremely counterproductive for so-called sort of human rights organizations to be lecturing the United States, claiming torture, making all sorts of allegations against the most powerful defender of freedom and democracy on the world stage.
Right, well,
your focus should be upon real human rights abuses, not upon your own country.
Let's look at that then. Christina Finch, let's turn the tables around. Should the United States go around the world lecturing other countries about their human rights records when it continues, and Obama has said since he took office that he will continue the practice of so-called extraordinary rendition, which frankly is a misnomer, isn't it, to the practice of kidnapping terror suspects and sending them to other countries where they very well may be tortured, as has happened in the past?
Well, I think we need to get away from American exceptionalism. Our human rights record should be subject to scrutiny by other countries, just as the record of other countries should be scrutinized. And I do take issue with Niall's point. I actually think that Guantanamo and some of the abuses conducted in the war on terror hurt our national security. These are blights on our human rights records that have made it more difficult for us to conduct our national defense. So what I'd like to see is absolutely accountability for the United States' abuses and accountability for other countries' abuses as well.
Scott Horton, can the U.S. then continue to defend its record while it continues to deport people to other countries without any legal process?
Well, I think it can and must defend its record, and I think it does have to answer questions here, and I think that's part of the democratic process. That's what distinguishes a democratic state from an authoritarian state. A democratic state should be able to justify everything it does in terms of law and its treaty commitments. And I think what Christina says is absolutely right. All the evidence right now shows that the terrorism threat has been driven largely by effective recruiting by terrorist organizations, and their principal recruiting tool has been evidence that's really irrefutable about the United States' embrace and use of torture and abusive techniques. So the most effective way for us to act now to stamp that out and pursue our own security interests is to adhere rigorously to our own law and our international commitments. And the last administration engaged in egregious violations. They've been well documented now. President Obama has promised to turn the page and walk away from those violations, and I think we have to acknowledge he's done a lot, but there's still an awful lot of open questions, and I think that it's a good exercise for the U.S. to answer those questions.
All right, well, Niall Gardner, then, is the U.S. adhering to its own laws when it continues the practice of targeted killing, quote-unquote, / assassinations? After all, there was a presidential order back in the 1970s made by Gerald Ford that spoke against, or at least banned, assassinations.
I presume you're referring to drone attacks in Pakistan, Afghanistan, for example, which are targeted against al-Qaeda terrorists, and which I must say has been extremely successful. And when you're fighting a war against a vicious enemy, you have to seek and destroy your enemy. We are fighting against a global network of Islamist terrorists who seek to harm the United States and its allies, and we will do everything necessary in order to defend the security of the United States. Facilities like Guantanamo, for example, have been extremely successful in the defense of the United States. No less than 32 al-Qaeda terrorist attacks have been foiled in recent years.
These drone attacks have left hundreds of civilians dead. The United States justifies it on the basis that it is part of its military action authorized by Congress. These attacks have increased exponentially under Obama. In fact, they've trebled. Scott Horton.
Well, I think that Niall's correct on one point. That is, to the extent drones are used as a weapon of warfare on a theater of war, attacking a legitimate target, there's no violation of international law there. But to the extent they're a miss, they don't strike a legitimate target, the intelligence was bad, they have horrible ramifications for the United States. I think the U.S. started this process very, very badly, and it's improved it, but the level of use of drones still raises a lot of questions. The most serious problem will be targeted executions, targeted killings that occur away from the field of battle. So if they're occurring in Yemen or Somalia, or if they're occurring on the streets in West Germany, and we have credible information that the Bush administration actually planned such an assassination, that would be a different matter, and that would be very serious. We've got the Obama administration now going to a federal court arguing effectively that the president has the right to authorize and direct the killing of an American citizen. That's a shocking claim of presidential power. They should be seeking to arrest this person if they can do it. They'd be authorized to use these extraordinary means only if they can justify war circumstances and the application of military law.
All right, in the time we've got remaining to us, I want to turn to some of the other elements that were contained in the discussions in the Human Rights Council. Of course, human rights not being simply about political and civic rights, but also about economic, social, and cultural rights. The U.S., Christina Finch, very quick to criticize some of its enemies, Cuba, Iran, other countries, about their treatment of minorities. What has the Obama administration done to reverse the Bush administration policy of dealing with its native population, Native Americans, who remain to this day largely confined to their reservations?
Well, thank you for bringing that issue up. The treatment of Native peoples is of extreme concern to Amnesty International. One measure that the Obama administration has taken to improve the condition of Native American and Alaska Native women is to sign the Tribal Law and Order Act, which will help reduce sexual violence against women in Indian country. Amnesty issued a report several years ago, about 2 years ago now, called Maze of Injustice, that detailed the shocking rates of sexual violence against women in Indian country. In one reservation, our researchers could not find a woman who had not been sexually assaulted. And it's important to note that almost 90% of these attacks are perpetrated by non-native citizens.
And in addition to all that, there are also, of course, accusations of the U.S. government constantly handing territory that belongs to these tribes, the Western Shoshone tribes, for example, to big corporations like Halliburton to continue to extract reserves such as gold, uranium ore, to continue to conduct nuclear tests as well. Should that be allowed to continue, Niall Gardner?
I have to say that this comparison of Indian reservations in the United States with, for example, what the Iranian government is doing to its own people, I think is completely ludicrous. And the United States guarantees freedom for all of its citizens, regardless of race, creed, background. And I do think it's rather farcical to be comparing what's happening in the United States with real human rights violations being carried out by government authorities in many countries in the world. And that should be the focus of the Human Rights Council Universal Periodic Review. The United States does more to defend the rights of all of its citizens, frankly, than any country on the face of the earth. That's a record to be tremendously proud of. And there's no evidence whatsoever that the government is suppressing any single minority organization in the United States. So let's keep the focus upon real state human rights violations.
Yeah, I think Niles was revealing his ignorance of the system and the way it works, because the United Nations has exercised a special role of responsibility in the protection of Aboriginal peoples that goes back a long time back to the mandate system. And it's absolutely correct for the UN to wade in here. And there are very serious issues concerning the way Native Americans are able to exercise control over their land and their property, particularly with respect to mineral rights. It's an issue the United States shares, particularly with Canada and Australia. Absolutely legitimate point. We haven't even gotten to the criminal justice system, and there we're seeing very powerful evidence put forward that there's a 2- or 3-tiered system in the United States, that members of racial minorities, particularly blacks, are far more likely to be prosecuted and receive far higher sentences than whites in the United States, especially on drug-related offenses. The United States really doesn't even have a response to that. It's acknowledged the validity of the data that's been collected.
Much more to discuss, but unfortunately we have to leave it there. Thank you all very much indeed for joining us. In New York, Scott Horton; in Washington, D.C., Niall Gardner; and in Geneva, Christina Finch. And thank you very much for joining us on this edition of Inside Story. We welcome your comments as always and your suggestions. You can email them to us at insidestory@aljazeera.net. Thanks for watching.